Hey guys, today I'm super proud to be bringing you a build that I've been working on, and I like to call this build Infinite Power. It's not only one of the strongest builds that I've created, but also one of the most versatile. You can literally use this build for pretty much everything in PvE. And going forward, this is the build that I'm going to be using. It works pretty much great in everything: open world, dungeons, terror rift, raids, you name it, pretty much everywhere. And I'll be sharing some gameplay later in the video. Not only is the damage insane, but you're also going to be constantly moving at the 70% maximum movement speed. And the build actually doesn't rely on primary attack at all. In fact, primary attack is actually doing one of the lowest damage in the build, so you're going to be fully mobile while dishing out a huge amount of damage. It also has one of the most consistent damages. I actually did a 1-minute damage test on the dummy, and the damage was super consistent. There's also huge potential to make improvements with the build. My setup isn't really that great, as you'll see. With my legendary gems, there's not really that much synergy in terms of this build, because usually I'm focusing on primary attack based builds a bit more. So if you have different gems to me, you're actually going to have an even more insane damage output. So some of you might be saying, bro, this sounds way too good to be true. What's the catch? There has to be a catch. Well, there's kind of a small catch. You will have infinite power and mobility, but the cost is that you're actually going to have to spam your skills like crazy as soon as they're off cooldown. So your fingers might get a bit tired, but I have covered other builds for Wizard where the playstyle is a bit more relaxed. But to me, it's kind of really cool to have this playstyle. It feels like you kind of have infinite mana and you're kind of just running around killing everything. So let's start off and just talk about a bit of the mechanics of this build. So first of all, let's talk about the skills quickly. So I'm using Slow Time, Lightning Nova, Disintegrate, Arcane Wind, and for the primary attack I'm using Magic Missile, but you can use Electrocute, it doesn't really matter. I only chose Magic Missile because it does slightly more damage. So moving on, let's talk about the essences. For the helmet essence, I'm using Terminus Facade. This helmet was buffed with the most recent patch, and I kind of want to talk about the mechanics of this a bit more in detail, so let's just look at the skills here. So what this says is that Slow Time now causes you to enter into a temporal flux for 5 seconds, pausing your non-channel skills to reduce the cooldown of your other skills by 1.2 seconds and increase your movement speed by 20%, stacking up to 60%. So the buffs basically came in two forms. First of all, this used to be 0.8 seconds, and the other thing is we didn't have this movement speed mobility. So I'm really grateful that this buff came to Wizard. In fact, I think it's one of the most interesting buffs and opens up a lot of different varieties for playstyles, and I've been experimenting with a lot of different builds because of it. So this essence might sound a bit complicated, but it's actually very simple to explain. So as you can see, I've got my Slow Time in my skill bar, and then all of my other skills, they're all non-channel skills, which means that you don't need to hold them down to channel them. And basically they have multiple charges, which means that I'll be able to spam them. So basically every time that I press one of these charges, I'm going to get a movement speed buff, and I'm also going to get a cooldown reduction to all of my other skills. So let's just have a quick look. Currently my movement speed is at 20%, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to press one of these skills here, so Slow Time, and let's press our Lightning Nova. So as you can see, what I'm going to get is 40% movement speed because I got one of the 20% stacks, and also it reduced the cooldown of all of my other skills by 1.2 seconds. Now granted, my other skills didn't need cooldown, but let's just go like this and press 1 and press 2. You can see that the Lightning Nova skill jumped. So let's just do that again. 1 and 2, the Lightning Nova skill jumped into the cooldown by 1.2 seconds. So I'm just going to spam these a bit. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see that it's jumping all the time when I'm spamming my Disintegrate there. If I keep doing this, let's just keep going for it. You can see that I'm able to actually spam these completely and just create this kind of arc reactor kind of unlimited energy, and also you'll be able to maintain extremely high movement speed. So if I just do this and check my movement speed, you can see that I'm at 70% movement speed here. So that's pretty much the most important mechanic of this build explained. Now let's move on to talk about the rest of the essence. So for the Lightning Nova essence, I'm using Isolated Storm, which is the new Lightning Nova essence. And this says that Lightning Nova now calls a lightning damage orb to orbit you, dealing lightning damage to enemies that it hits. This just deals a huge amount of damage. I think it's one of the highest Lightning Nova damage dealers. And it also gives you 2 charges, which is really good. So if you don't have this essence, you could also use the Coat of Astrum chest essence for Lightning Nova, which actually works pretty well. So it actually gives you more range and a 3rd charge of Lightning Nova, which is really good, but the downside is the damage was considerably lower. So I wouldn't really recommend you to use the Coat of Astrum if you've already found this essence. So the next essence I'm using for Lightning Nova is the Offhand essence, the Frenetic Spark. This one's pretty easy to explain. It's just giving you 18.6% Lightning Nova cooldown, and it also gives you Lightning Nova damage on the Awakening, which is really nice on this build because Lightning Nova is one of the main damage dealers. So for the last Lightning Nova essence, I'm also using another new essence, which is the Radiant Splines. So what this reads is that when Lightning Nova deals a critical hit, it emits a charged bolt, which deals 12,600 damage, and the damage is increased by 90%. This is a really nice essence to have, dealing a huge ton of critical hit, so it's just giving me that extra damage. If you don't have this, then you could also use the old essence, which is the Thunderbird's Bite, which just gives flat lightning damage. It also works decently well on this build. So moving on to talk about the Disintegrate essence. The only essence I'm using for Disintegrate is the War Mage Mantle. This essence was also recently buffed in the patch, and it says that Disintegrate now launches small arcane spheres that bounces between you and multiple enemies, dealing damage and shattering their armor. So this is a really nice essence to have, because basically with this single essence, it turns Disintegrate charges into 3, and it basically turns Disintegrate into this projectile, as you can see. And the good thing about this is that if you go to the skills, you'll be able to see that it's also dealing a huge amount of damage and applying a 6% damage increase for 2 seconds, stacking up to a maximum of 3 times. So you can get this up to 18% extra damage from shattering the armor, which is really, really good. So finally, let's talk about the Arcane Wind essence. So for Arcane Wind, I'm using 3 essence, which is the pants, the Galebringer leggings. So what this does is that it gives you Arcane Wind flat damage, but it also gives you Arcane Wind cooldown on the Awakening. This is probably the single most important slot to awaken in this build, because you really need this Arcane Wind cooldown decreased by 10%. It just makes the build flow a lot better, so this is why I'm using this. And for the main hand, I'm using the Mistral Rend. It's kind of becoming a common theme. All of the essence that I'm using have been buffed in this build. So what this basically reads is that Arcane Wind now unleashes a condensed Arcane Vortex that bounces between you and multiple enemies and slows them, and it also does a huge amount of damage. This is very similar to the War Mage Mantle. Both of these kind of turn the skills into projectiles, so let's just have a look how this looks. So yeah, it turns it into this kind of spiraling projectile, and let's just take a quick look at the damage. It's also doing an insane amount of damage. If we have a look, it's also 31,000. This is very similar to the Disintegrate. Both of them do extremely similar damage, and they also have multiple charges. But as you can see, Arcane Wind has 4 charges here, and the reason for that is because I'm using this offhand essence, the Unrepentant Gale. So what this reads is that it gives Arcane Wind an extra charge. So this by itself gives Arcane Wind 3 charges. This will give you another extra charge, and it also gives you a little bit of cooldown, which is really nice. So between the 3.6 here and the 10% from the Awakening here, you have 13.6 cooldown, which with the 17% cooldown that I have will make my Arcane Wind have the maximum cooldown, which is 30%. So now let's talk about the set bonuses which I'm using. So I'm using 4 pieces of Banquet, which is really good. It gives you extra damage on enemies suffering from continual damage effects, and it also gives you a critical hit chance. For each continual damage effect, you get 2.5% critical chance, up to 25%. It's a really good set to use on this build. And then the other set which I'm using is 4 pieces of Vithu. Some of you might be a bit confused about this choice. For the 2-piece, it's really important to have the extra 30% beneficial to keep 100% uptime of your slow time. For the increased attack speed, which is 30%. Like I said, this isn't a primary attack based build, so this attack speed isn't really for your primary attack speed. It's actually more for the projectile attack speed. What I noticed is that with the higher attack speed, it actually makes your projectiles move a bit faster. And when I actually took this off and tested other sets, it actually made my damage go considerably lower, so I wouldn't recommend switching this out either. So finally, let me show the legendary gems that I'm using. And bear in mind, my setup is extremely poor for this build. You guys will be able to perform way better than me if you have more decent gems. I'm only actually getting 1 or 2 stacks of this Banquet set because I don't really have that many continual damage effects. And let's just go ahead and get started. So I'm actually using Gloom Cask, which is completely useless for this build, and I've auxiliaried it with Hellfire Fragment because I don't really have anything better. I would replace this with anything that does continual damage effects. Let's say Viper's Bite, Everlasting Torment, Igneous Scorn, just whatever you have that makes a continual damage effect or gives you outright damage. Pain Clasp would be great, Fervent Fang would be great. Anything aside from this basically would be good. Let's move on to talk about Void Spark. So Void Spark is actually a pretty decent gem to use. It's still one of my favorite gems to use for PvE. If you have this, then I would say you should use it. This is probably one of the better gems that I have on my setup. The Bloodsoaked Jade doesn't need any introduction. It's pretty much a must-have if you have it, and it's a really good gem to use on this setup. And then let's talk about the Echoing Shade. So this is pretty much completely useless on this build. I would replace it with anything else. You can see that I've auxiliaried it with the Storm Vault. Like I said, just go for raw damage or continual damage effects would really be better than this. And then the Seeping Vial is actually one of the better gems also because it's providing a continual damage poison effect. So this is a really good gem to have. So now let's move on to the next gem. I'm using Svensson's Haunting without any auxiliary, and this is pretty nice in PvE, but it isn't a continual damage effect, but it's still providing a decent amount of damage for this build. If I had something better, then I would probably use it instead of this. And then next, let's go for the Howler's Call. I've already mentioned this in my last video. I wish I had Roiling Consequence. It would just make this build so much better. If you have a Roiling Consequence ranked up, let me know what kind of damage numbers you're getting for this build, because I'm sure you'd be getting really insane damage. And then finally, I'm using Bottled Hope, which is actually a pretty decent gem to use for this build. So overall, you can see that I'm using quite a lot of auxiliaries, and like I said, I'm not really getting the maximum bonus from this 4-piece banquet. So with the right gems, the potential damage output for this build would be just insane. Another thing which I haven't really spent time to optimize on this build is the Reforges. You can see this is what the Reforges that I'm using look like. So obviously I'm using primary attack damage on all of my pieces, and primary attack isn't really doing so much damage on this build. If I had skill damage here instead of primary attack, this would just take this build to another level. All of the damage that we're dealing is from skills, as you'll see in the damage breakdown, which I have later. If I had skill damage here, I believe that the damage I would do would be just a lot more insane. So now let's move on to talk about the Paragon tree setup. You're kind of free to choose whatever Paragon you like for this build. It doesn't really matter so much, but for a damage setup, I like to use something like this. So these 3 nodes here and these 2 nodes. Bear in mind that you will have to use your primary attack if you want to activate these 3 nodes for the maximum amount of damage. Other than that, Treasure Hunter would work great, so you could just go for these. But like I said, this build is extremely versatile. This is the build that I'm going to be using for everything PvE. The only thing that you could potentially switch between would be the Paragon tree. So if you're running things like open world, you could go for more of a Treasure Hunter tree, and if you need a bit more damage, then you could go for the Slinger tree. For the legendary skill for this build, the only one that's useful in PvE, I already mentioned in my last video. If you haven't watched that video, I would recommend you guys to check it out. But the only one that would be useful would be Lightning Rod, I guess, next week when people reach the Paragon to equip legendary skills. This is the one that I would recommend. So now let's move on, and I'll show a 1-minute damage test on the dummy for this build. So here we go. As you can see here, the burst isn't quite as impressive as the DPS build which I recently had on my channel, but the damage output is still insane. And what's impressive about this, and the reason why I wanted to do a 1-minute damage test, is just to show the consistency of the damage for this build. And you have to remember that compared to my DPS build, which doesn't have any mobility, this build is moving at maximum mobility, so it's just completely crazy. And you can just see that it's actually not going under 6 million. In fact, it's kind of rising up to 7 million again. Over 30 seconds, I think my damage was 7.1 million per second. The total damage I'm doing is completely crazy. And yeah, I can see that this build, to be honest, a lot of wizards are going to be using this build moving forward. The only downside of it, like I said, is that you have to spam your skills like crazy. You can see that in the top left, my banquet bonus is only going to 2 or 3 at best, which is really bad. So if you guys have better legendary gems than me, this is just going to be completely insane. And especially if you have a ranked up Mother's Lament or a ranked up Roiling Consequence, where it actually increases your critical hit chance even more, the damage output I could see being absolutely crazy with this build. So let's just have a look at the breakdown. As you can see, first of all, Magic Missile is doing barely any damage. This isn't a primary attack based build. The majority of the damage is coming from both Arcane Wind and Lightning Nova, as you can see, and the Disintegrate is just buffing both of those because it does give an armor break effect up to 18%, and it still does do substantial damage by itself. So this is exactly why I would recommend you guys to use the skill damage Reforge. So now I'm going to be sharing some gameplay for you guys. And let's just start off with some open world. I'm just going to show a short clip here. And this build is just such a joy to play. Like, I mean, I know that you have to mash the buttons, which can be a bit annoying, but I really love this kind of playstyle, and it's just so much fun. The visual effect also looks really cool with the orbs orbiting around you, and you're just shooting projectiles ahead of you, which kind of bounce between enemies, and it's just looking so cool. So now let's move on just to show a bit of Terrorist gameplay. This is actually Inferno 3. And you can see how quick I'm killing the orange mobs here when they do spawn. So there we go, that one just melted there. And yeah, this is Inferno 3, by the way, that just melted as well. It's just so cool just watching the gameplay for this build. Let's just do a couple of the Stygian Spires here and see how quick we can do it. I think there should be one down here somewhere. Okay, yeah, here we go. I'll just show you guys how it looks. I'm getting carried away just playing this build, but yeah, let's go try to kill this as fast as possible, just killing off some of the mobs. Do let me know if you try this build out, guys, because I'm really curious to hear what you guys think, or if you have any improvements or anything that you've noticed. I was really keen to just share my findings and share the build itself because it is so cool. You can see my projectiles are just bouncing into the boss and easily killing it. And I'll just do one more pillar here. Let's just move on, because there was one more pillar that spawned right next to this one. So here we go. I got lucky, and yeah, let's just try to clear this as fast as possible. You can see how quick it's just shredding through everything. I barely see the monsters on the screen. Elite packs just kill them so quickly. But here we go, the boss. I think I killed this boss super quick. It didn't even have time to do its attack. Let's just see. Here we go. And it's dead. That's just insane. This is Inferno 3. I have to remind you guys, it's just crazy. So I'm going to move on now to show some Oblivion Pillar gameplay. I actually wouldn't recommend you guys to run Oblivion Pillars without the Hailstone Essence, because that gives you immunity charges, but I was so excited to just try this build out just to see how it would do. And as you can see, I am pretty squishy because I am a wizard, so it is kind of rough when I move into the edges and take some of the damages from the outer circle. But I am able to kind of clear everything really, really fast. The mobility is really nice. And here we go, the boss should be about to spawn now, hopefully. Yeah, here we go. I got Zolthrax, which probably isn't one of the best bosses to play against, but let's just see how quickly he goes down. And there we go. So one thing to note in all of these clips is I was actually playing with the Treasure Hunter Paragon tree, and I realized after I recorded it that I was playing with the wrong Paragon tree. So I decided to fix my Paragon tree and try the build out in dungeons, and I'm just going to show how it does in the final boss. I know that I've shared a lot of gameplay here, so I didn't really want to show the whole dungeon run. I'll just show how the boss fight went, and this is an Inferno 3 dungeon, by the way. You can see that from the health of the boss, and you can see that once it gets going, I can actually kill the boss really fast. You can see that I was standing still while the boss spawned, but it might actually be worth charging up all of your attacks before the boss actually spawns, because that will spawn a bunch of lightning novas, which will probably one-shot the boss faster than I did here. Before I end the video, I want to talk about some variations to the build and some things which I tried to test and didn't quite work as well. So the reason why this build works so well is that we have multiple charges of the skills, which keeps resetting the cooldown, like I said, with slow time. And the other thing is that all of these skills have very low cooldown. You can see that this has a 6-second cooldown, this also another 6 seconds, and this also has a 6 seconds cooldown. And the other thing is that I have a maximum cooldown on all three of these skills. So I already mentioned this in the video, I have a 17% cooldown reduction here, and the way I'm getting maximum cooldown on Lightning Nova is simply from using the Frenetic Spark. For the Arcane Wind, I'm getting it from the 10% here and the 3.6% here. And I haven't got any cooldown for Disintegrate simply because there's not really any good ways to get cooldown for Disintegrate. The only way to get cooldown for Disintegrate, from what I've seen, is from the Pants Essence, which a lot of people like to use, which is, let me just have a look, it should be this one here, the Hasten Oblivion. So it reads that Disintegrate's cooldown is reduced by 1.6 seconds when damaging enemies. So you actually have to hit enemies to get this cooldown effect, and also the Awakening slot is giving damage, so it's really not ideal to use this. It's much better used to actually get Arcane Wind cooldown, which is the reason why I went for these Pants Essence here. One variation which I was experimenting with, which didn't quite work out as well as I'd hoped, is going for a different skill. Instead of the Disintegrate, I went for Teleport with this Teleport Essence here, which reads that you gain a teleport charge when you defeat an enemy. Cannot occur more often than once every 15 seconds. This essence should probably get buffed in my opinion, but I was using this and it gives you teleport cooldown by 10%, so I went with this. And also I changed the skill from Disintegrate to Teleport, so this is the build that I was going with. The problem is Teleport has quite a long cooldown. You still do get 3 charges of it, which is really nice, but the cooldown just was a bit too long, even though it made me kind of dash around, which is really cool, and I was trying it with the Gloom Guide set piece. It didn't quite work out as well. There might be something there to actually work Teleport into a build for PvP, but I'm still experimenting with this. If I do find something, then I will be making a video for it. Another variation which I tried to get to work was the Meteor variation, to try get a bit more firestorms. So there is actually a Meteor Pants which you can use, which is quite good. So you'd be giving up the Arcane Wind cooldown and going for the Apocalypse route. It reads that Meteor now causes the ground to erupt, damaging and burning enemies in a targeted area. So this was actually pretty good, and I went for a different shoulders, which was the Meteor shoulders, this one here, the Stag of Ill Omen. After casting Meteor, your damage is increased by 19%. So I went for something like this, and also I added Meteor into my skills. So here we go. I just did something like this. One other change you could potentially make, but I really wouldn't actually recommend it, is to switch out this chest piece to go for one of the Meteor chests, which works very well. It's this one here that reads that you get 9.5% crit for 3 seconds when you use Meteor, stacking up to 3 times. This works really well with the pants, but when I tried it, it really wasn't that good. The problem is the chest slot is always used for Lightning Nova. And Lightning Nova paired with the Arcane Wind are the 2 skills which I really wouldn't recommend to switch out. You could potentially switch out Disintegrate, which is why I decided to try out these variations here. This is what the Meteor effect looks like, but it was quite underwhelming when I did test it. The idea behind this was also to try out the different essence. So instead of this essence, you actually have 2 options, which I kind of want to quickly mention. So for Arcane Wind, you can go for either this one here, which is actually pretty good because it does give you Arcane Wind cooldown as the Awakening. So whereas this one gives you damage and only 3.6% cooldown, this will give you a whole 10% cooldown. So if your cooldown is low, I would actually recommend you to use this offhand instead. But the idea was for me to actually use a different offhand, which is one of the newer offhands, which not many people use. It's actually this one. Arcane Wind deals 38% more damage when igniting a Firestorm. So this was kind of the build that I did test. So since we don't have a consistent way to trigger Firestorm aside from the Rolling Consequence gem, I thought that this build could have potential since we're using Meteor to trigger it here. But when I did test this, it wasn't quite as good as the original build with Disintegrate. That's about everything that I wanted to share for this one, guys. If you have watched this far into the video, then I want to really thank you so much for watching. Please do give this build a try, and please do share it to your friends. I really do recommend you guys to try this build out. It's probably one of the most fun and versatile builds that I've ever played in this game, so do give it a try. For now, I'm going to be signing off, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Peace.